1 Thessalonians contains a repeated term that is worth talking about. Instead of referring to the gospel of Jesus Christ, Paul refers repeatedly to the gospel of God. In fact, it turns out that Paul uses this term throughout his letters almost as frequently as he uses the phrase the gospel of Christ. This naturally begs the question, is there a difference between these two things? And if so, what does the gospel of God even refer to? Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Wednesday, April 24th, 2024. Like a lot of words and phrases Paul uses, he doesn't fully define his terms. He assumes his readers know what he's talking about. In some cases, as with the Thessalonians, he has a pre-existing relationship with his readers, so they would undoubtedly have been familiar with the term. But in other cases, especially with the letter to the Romans, his readers have never met the man and would have to understand from the context of the letter what he means. Everyone would have known the meaning of the word gospel. It was a general term that simply meant good news. Turns out, it wasn't even a particularly religious term. In one interesting ancient inscription, a Roman official referred to the birthday of Caesar as gospel, good news, as in the good news of the birthday of Caesar. This is really no different from the way we talk about good news generally. We can use it to describe a favorable medical diagnosis. Good news, the tumor is benign. We can use it to talk about just about any piece of good fortune we run into. But we don't use the term gospel, at least not in English. In English usage, gospel has taken on a meaning it didn't originally have. We use it to talk specifically about the Christian message. And if we ever use it in a non-religious sense, we use it to emphasize the truth of whatever we are saying. Gospel truth, we might say. All of which is sort of interesting. But what's now the difference between the gospel of God and the gospel of Jesus Christ? Well, in truth, there's not enough difference to amount to much, but there is a slight distinction. The way Paul uses the terms, the gospel of God points to the source and origin of the good news, and gospel of Christ points to the content of that good news. Where does the good news come from? Well, it comes from God, the God whom we have known in the scriptures of the Old Testament. What is the content of that good news? It is the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ, who has offered salvation not only to Jews, but now also to Gentiles, and whom we come to know in the New Testament. Listen to how Paul uses it in today's reading from 1 Thessalonians. You remember, he says, our labor and toil, brothers and sisters. We worked night and day so that we might not burden any of you while we proclaimed to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how pure and upright and blameless our conduct was toward you believers. As you know, we dealt with each one of you like a father with his children, urging and encouraging you and pleading that you lead a life worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. Well, it's certainly subtle. It's not immediately obvious from the context, but it makes sense how he uses this phrase. The Thessalonians were Gentile converts, not Jewish. Jewish converts would naturally associate the gospel of Christ with the God they had always known. Gentile converts needed to be taught that the good news in Jesus Christ was tied to a God who was already known and whose purpose had always been the blessing of the world, but who now had opened the way to salvation to those outside of Israel, outside Jewish believers. Which then leads to Paul's concluding sentence, in which he urges the Thessalonians to lead a life worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. That's really the important thing here, isn't it? Good news, once received and accepted, calls us to live a certain kind of life, a life worthy of the God who in infinite mercy and grace has called us and accepted us as his own. In other words, in good Reformed fashion, God's grace calls for a response of gratitude. Gospel, gratitude. That's as simple and direct a summary of the Christian message as there can possibly be. Tomorrow, an orphaned Paul. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.